support for runtime class. The first iteration of the KEP is actually already merged, but I'll give a quick overview of that for people who might not have seen it. So the goal here is to support heterogeneous nodes in a cluster. So maybe some nodes support some set of runtime classes, and another set of nodes support another set of runtime classes. And we want to make it so that this is kind of the set of nodes that support what set of runtime classes is sort of defined at the cluster level or through the runtime class or the nodes or something like that. And the users don't really need to think about that topology too much. So if I say I want to run with the Windows Hyper-V runtime class, then I know that I'm going to get scheduled onto a Windows node that supports that. So at a high level, the proposal is to add a new topology struct to the runtime class definition. And within the topology, there would be essentially some sort of node selector and a set of tolerations. And so both of these are required because the node selector says these are the nodes that I want to match. So that's sort of an attractive scheduling thing, kind of pulling the pod to the set of nodes. Then tolerations are necessary so that in the event that you don't have a runtime class for every pod or like complete coverage of all the different combinations, you want to be able to repel some pods that, for instance, repel the regular default Linux containers from the Windows nodes. And so tolerations is a way to kind of avoid repelling the runtimes that actually should be scheduled there. At a high level, that's kind of all there is to it. Now there's some details in how we actually go about implementing this. The first proposal, which is the version that's actually merged, is to mix in these node selector terms and tolerations into the pod spec. So this would happen as at admission time, as a mutating admission controller built in. Tolerations is really easy. We just append the tolerations from the runtime class to the pod's tolerations, and eliminate some duplicates there. The node selector bit is a little trickier and depends on the node selector model that we choose. The easiest would be to just use a map string and say, these are the labels and the values that must match exactly to the nodes to be scheduled on. That's the easiest, but also the least powerful, and makes it hard if we have kind of differing nodes that kind of both support the same runtime class. So a better option might be node selector requirements, which are have more expressive operations. So I can say, I want to match nodes that have this label with values in this set, and maybe a version greater than 6 or whatever. But it's still an AND set of operations. And this needs to be mixed in by appending these to every node affinity term, because those affinity terms are ORed across them. We could also do just a straight up node affinity selector, which lets us OR across different sets of nodes. But now to merge that, we have to take a cross product of all the different selectors to actually merge that in. So the alternative to merging is to just add a new predicate to the scheduler. And that's what the second follow-up proposal adds. So this says basically instead of merging them in at admission time, the scheduler would actually understand runtime classes and would find the associated runtime class of the pod at scheduling time and take these into account. And one advantage that Bobby, who's one of the SIG scheduling TLs, pointed out is that then we can get a nice error message in the event that a pod can't be scheduled that can explain that this runtime class wasn't supported on this set of nodes. And another advantage is if we want to use the more expressive node affinity selector, then we don't have to worry about doing this cross-product merge logic and don't have to kind of explode the pod affinity terms for that. So yeah, I think that's the overview. Are there any kind of questions or comments?
Yeah, I got a quick question on this. So I know that in version, I think it was 12 or 13, there was some restrictions set on what labels the kubelet could automatically set. So do we also need to basically modify that filter to allow some of the new labels that would be needed here, or do we want to like propose a few that need to be added? In the use cases, you call out like run HCS, or sorry, run C versions, and then of course, like on Windows, whether or not Hyper-V is available. And so I think that those are things that we would want to add as node labels. So do we want to roll that into the same cap, or is that sort of a separate thing we need to tackle?
Yeah, that's a great point. I should go and add that to the cap. So there's kind of a few different things here. One, there's restrictions on what labels a node can self-apply, but there's not restrictions on what labels like an administrator or provisioner can apply to the nodes. And this also kind of comes in as a security issue. If I want to be able to say that, this privileged runtime class shouldn't be run on unprivileged nodes or something like that, I want to make sure that that unprivileged label or whatever label it's selecting on can be self-applied by those nodes so that they can escalate privileges. But on the other hand, if we ever want to do any sort of like, automated discovery of supported runtimes, then those labels would need to be supported for self-labeling of the node.
Okay, so maybe what we should put in here is just sort of clarifying, these ones can be used as part of these use cases that are auto-applied. That might include things like the OS and kernel version that we have there today. And then we could just say, if we want additional ones like, particular runtimes configured, then we can just say, make sure that you add those when you add the node to the cluster. That's kind of what you're saying?
Yeah. Just to clarify, having nodes self-report what times they support is out of scope for this cap. So that's assuming that nodes have already been labeled in the cluster. Yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, I'll open a PR to kind of clarify some of this stuff around labeling schemas and best practices around that.
Okay, sounds good.
Here's another question people ask you. Is the runtime class a superset of the other ways of the influencing scheduling? You may already answer, but just...
Yeah, so this is a good question and kind of something we've run into a few different times with runtime class is sort of what is the overlap between runtime class and kind of general cluster policy. I don't want runtime class to become a generic policy mechanism. We could kind of dig into reasons for that, but I don't really want to go too deep on that right now. So is it a superset? I think it is a subset. And so this should be another way, another kind of set of constraints that get factored in when scheduling a pod. And so you might still want, there's an open proposal for scheduling policy. And we've kind of talked about breaking that into two different scheduling policies. One that would actually be like, you know, any pod in this namespace with this set of labels or something like that gets all of these scheduling constraints applied to it. And so in that case, runtime class would just be applied on top of that. I guess there's some question about how tolerations overlap with that. If I want to have a scheduling policy that validates that certain tolerations are absent on a pod, then it would be hard to do that if the tolerations are mixed in at scheduling time rather than at admission time. That was sort of a rambly answer. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Are there any drawbacks as far as your second proposal? And like, have you, I guess I can look closer at it, but I mean, does it seem like pretty reasonable from the scheduling point of view? Are they accepting?
Yeah, so that one I just thought of about the tolerations, I think is a drawback of that. And so actually maybe what we want is some sort of something in between where the tolerations are mixed in into admission time and the node selector is taken into account at scheduling time. I think the big drawback is kind of visibility into the scheduling logic. That if you take the mix-in approach, then you can kind of just look at the pod spec and say, okay, here's all the scheduling rules that were factored in, and here's why it ended up on this node. On the other hand, if you do it in the scheduler, then you can have a nice error message in the event that it's not scheduled, explaining that, oh, hey, this runtime class that you're using isn't supported, doesn't run on these nodes. So that one feels like a bit more of a trade-off. I guess another disadvantage of the scheduling approach is it does mean modifying the scheduler. It's a pretty pluggable architecture, so I don't see that as a big drawback. But it does mean that the scheduler would need to start watching the runtime class API to be able to look up and kind of cross-reference those runtime classes with the pods.
I see that as kind of, I'm looking at a precedent of how progress goes on this and what could be done with respect to then overheads as a kind of a next step.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a bit separate, obviously, but conceptually kind of, it's the same idea of where to put the solution, I think.
Right. One difference with pod overhead is the kubelet needs to be aware of that. And so there, I guess once you have multiple components that need to kind of reference that, maybe it makes more sense on the pod.
Yeah, I agreed.
Yeah, because then you have like resource quota plus the scheduler plus the kubelet.
And where, I don't recall where eviction, I guess that's in kubelet as well.
Yeah, and there's always the possibility that the runtime class could be modified. Even if we make these immutable fields, you can still delete the runtime class and recreate it. And so in the case of scheduling, once the pod is already scheduled, we don't really need that scheduling information except for kind of introspection and debugging. But with something like pod overhead, you would probably want to have that be consistent as long as the pod exists.
Okay, you're making this seem simple now. Okay. For the decision for schedule. Okay.
Anything else? Or should should we move on?
So you already have the cap updates sent out, and since we have the new policy this time, so have you identified a group of the reviewer for this one yet? Like Bobby, obviously from the SIG scheduler, and have you identified the reviewer yet for this?
I think I've voluntold you.
Okay, okay, and I hope Eric also is another one
Yeah, I'll
because
add
since
Eric.
he's driving the pod overhead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Does that sound good, Eric?
Sure, happy to help.
Cool. Let's move to the next one. I think someone proposed to talk about the PR, and then I think that for the shorting the admin parts.
Yeah, yes. Yes. Can you hear me, guys?
Yes, we can. Can you read?
A bit quiet. Yeah.
Yeah. Can I share my screen?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Actually, I raised a PR. Okay, that PR to remove the old code sorting mechanism, like this. Oh,
Yes.
sorry. Actually, sorting like this. Then I added new code. This one is working in Go 1.7. Before 1.7, they used to sort by using like this. Then I added new one after from 1.7. After 1.7, we'll use this one. Okay, I added new one. I got too many comments like. Then finally, this discussion came like, is it necessary to sort the part? Okay, then finally this he added a comment like we need to sort through the admission process in that order. Okay, then I found few test cases were failing when I'm without sorting, adding the admitting part without sorting this one. So I raised another PR. It's a test PR only, work in progress. Just I removed the sorting code here. Okay, before admitting the part, handle the part in Kubernetes.go. Okay, then I removed the test cases which is failing. This is a test case handle part conflict. This conflict is coming because of same port. We are using same port and adding the creation timestamp manually like this here. So I commented this one. Then another one is handling memory exceeded. They're doing the same thing here, adding the part-time, creation timestamp manually here, then sending it to handle part admission, admitting this one. I commented this one also. So this PR, it's working fine in the test. Yeah, all the tests are working fine. Okay. Uh, this one also working fine, but here we have too many discussion, like we need to cover, really need to cover, we really need this starting mechanism, because when I try to create a E2E for this scenario, okay, starting this one, I was trying to update manually my part creation timestamp, like 1 minute, like how they are updating here. I just updated my part creation timestamp here like this. Okay, but it's not getting reflected because that kubelet, when it is creating the pod, it's updating the timestamp, overwriting the timestamp whatever I'm sending to this kubelet. Okay, so I think it is not necessary to sort. If I'm wrong, just correct me or explain me. Is it necessary to start here, or no need to start? We remove this code or keep this code, or yeah.
I personally think it's necessary to sort by the creation time. And I think that's the way we are ensure of the first come, first serve, and a lot of logical we base on the creation time.
Yeah, currently.
So that's why I'm not sure. I'm not clear. Understand the. I thought you have that you simplify code, which is really good, using the method to sort, and so I saw that the review only asked for some test to test the coverage because you delete unit test, because your change, and based on your change, you delete the unit test. So I believe the Aaron just raised the question, since you delete unit test, can we add some other test coverage?
Yeah, actually, we cannot directly add unit test for this one because they are in this function. They are sorting the pod, whatever the pod we are sending. So I think we cannot call the same function by by uh, by this. I mean, uh, without sorting the. I mean, admitting the pod without sorting this. I tried this one. 1 minute, I will share the same that unit test also. Yeah, I tried this unit test. Yeah, my internet is very slow. Yeah, this is my unit test. Here I added a code, added a function here. Okay, this function will handle the pod. Okay, handle the, I mean, admit the pod without sorting it. So I added this one. So Legit, yeah, Jordan Legit added a comment like we cannot add a function to handle only for test cases. We cannot add this function. So I added comment like I need to get clarity from my test case. This is the, sorry, from my PR, pod creation time based on. Then if I got the clarity, then I can fix it.
Sure.
Yeah. So I need a.
Sorting is still necessary, and I don't, unless there's a reason why we need to remove this behavior. I'm not sure about the testing part. I haven't looked at that closely, but it sounds like the problem is just like you cannot add a test to properly test this behavior, and that should not be a reason to remove this. And we can, I think we can discuss on PR on how to fix it.
Okay, if sort is necessary, then here I remove the sorting code. So it should fail right here because I commented the sort. So it should fail here, but it is not failing. It's working fine. All the test cases are working fine here.
Then we need to fix the test cases, I think.
We can indicate we don't have enough test coverage. The only thing I can see that one, there's the, you remove that one and you make that water, it is out of order, and there's no test capture that one. Then it just indicate that we need to do better job to improve the test coverage.
Yeah, by the way, I don't think we need end-to-end test for this.
Yeah, we don't need.
Yeah. Actually, end-to-end test, right? I was trying to create an end-to-end test by updating the pod timestamp, but it is not getting. I mean, it is not getting reflected whatever I'm sending the first part. For example, I'm sending two part by updating the timestamp like this. Okay, but whenever the part gets added, it's overriding whatever I'm updating the timestamp. It's overriding the timestamp that Kubernetes is updating its own timestamp whenever the part get created. It's like first come first serve. Whatever is coming first, it's adding those part. Whatever is coming second, it's rejecting that part. If anything conflict is there, some like port conflict or memory exceeding conflict, something.
So the pod spec, except the image, and today later we have another discussing and relate make some other field is mutable, but currently only image and the pod spec perspective, and there's it's not that field, the creation timestamp actually is not mutable. Only system can update that one. By design, right? So once you create that part and you update that creation time, and you shouldn't change that.
No, yeah, I tried that one, so not working. But creation timestamp is important here because we are sorting part based on creation timestamp, right? This one sorting based on this creation timestamp only. 1 minute, I will show.
Can we carry this discussion
Yes,
offline on the PR or maybe on Slack? I think it's hard for everyone to follow and review this PR.
You two review I just want to say that actually the order based on the creation time is pretty important for our logical, especially when the admission. So that handle addition, actually it is also could be failed apart due to some resource. So the creation time actually it is the key part for us to decide which one should admit and which one should to get that resource. So that's actually at least we should agree on that one.
Okay, but I did not get you the clear picture. Hello?
Hello?
Yeah, but I did not get a clear picture of this one. Is this really necessary to sort or no need to sort?
So how about after this meeting and we carry and Yuji, can you take over this one and update what we discussed? At least why we need that shorting. And we at least we can agree on one thing and then we can move forward.
Okay.
And help you to figure out how to do some rest stuff.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Let's move to next topic. And let's talk to the vertical scaling.
Hi, this is Vinay. So I'm following up from last week's discussion. We discussed a bunch of issues with Derek and David. I have updated the KEP. I went through the flow control as we discussed on the email thread, on the review thread. I split it up into 2 pod conditions and then went through the logic, and then I've updated that. I just pushed the update like just before this meeting. So I'm hoping that during this coming week or so, we can take another review of the current flow control, the container level policies and the pod level retry policies that are mentioned in there. I also captured the notes that David had, the concerns that David had regarding lowering memory, sitting in a control loop and then trying to lower it, and then when the memory lowering is completely successful, then it updates the resources allocated. So I just wanted to see if there is any other outstanding issues with this, with the current KEP. The other point that I wanted to look into is I also looked at the pod overhead that Tim and Eric is working on now. And my initial thoughts are that the scheduler is just gonna add today. Scheduler sums up the container resource requests, and then based on that, it sorts and filters a node and picks a node for scheduling. For update, we're going with the same flow, and in the case of pod overhead, I believe that component gets added to the containers requests and it becomes part of the scheduling decision. So it's just a constant that gets added for update as well. I don't see any impact to it for the KEP that I have, at least the flow control that I have. However, one of the points that I wanted to check with Tim or Eric is this something that Kubernetes should be reporting via metrics so that VPA can potentially, make recommendations going forward sometime in the future? VPA currently is, and it's not just VPA, there are other plugins that are working towards like AI-based and machine learning-based algorithms that want to make better recommendations for pod resource usage. And this could potentially be one of the things if this can vary. If this is a constant, then it's probably not so important. So that was the only point I wanted to raise, and I did loop in the VPA folks so that they're aware of this feature that's coming in, and if they have any interest in managing this.
I think the intention is that the pod overhead would essentially be constant depending on the runtime, and so the runtime developers would basically say, this is the pod overhead that we recommend being associated with this runtime.
Okay.
I can
in reality, it won't be constant, but I think that this is the trade-off that we can make for the heuristic of being a lot better than where we're at now. But
Yeah.
Right. Okay. If this is something that benefits from, if it won't be constant and it might benefit from an external entity like VPA or some other kind of ML prediction algorithm, taking a look at it and making predictions on it and then updating it from via a patch, then maybe it's not priority, but it's probably something to consider exposing via kubelet to track it in a metric server, API reporting.
Actually, I wonder how that works in a sandbox runtime. Anyway, where the metrics, I guess the metrics are coming from the CRI, so you do have the per container metrics, but it could be the case that there is additional overhead that would end up factoring in there. Sorry, just sort of thinking out loud here.
Sure, no worries.
Yeah, it seems to me like something that could potentially be useful, but probably isn't worth focusing on too much at this time. Maybe we should kind of wait and see how the feature shakes out and ends up being used.
Okay.
Do you agree, Eric?
Yeah, I see the overhead being really at the pod level. I wouldn't consider it on a per container basis. I see a tail going around the room.
Yeah, well, it is pod level. The main question is it worth taking the effort to put it into the reporting stream from kubelet so that it can be tracked in Prometheus or metric server for VPA to look at and potentially update in the future.
I see.
So today,
at this point, they just scrape the pod C group. Is that right?
I believe so.
Yeah.
Currently, the metric server is just summing container resource usage. So we've known for a while that we think someday we will want pod level resource usage directly from the pod C group, but we haven't added that because we haven't had a reason to.
Okay.
We have a lot of missing steps to add that here. Like for example, pod level overhead. Even we have the pod level overhead mechanism, it's not mean we are successfully charged that to the pod C group. So there's a many missing steps here. So we are not there yet. But the pod level, pod overhead concept introduced to the node, even it is constant, even maybe it's dynamic, but we just only can constant, it still is better than today. And will help us to doing the scheduling and at the missing time, we can take that into consideration.
Yeah.
Right now, we just blindly reserve some for Kubernetes, system. Some is for the kernel. So we only have that 2 big blocks. So we cannot really make the smart, more intelligent decision.
And even worse, you can't protect the node necessarily because you don't take this into account. So you would kill the sandbox runtime.
Yeah. So I don't want pod overhead. It's because it's haven't complete the stuff and make the the vertical auto scaling even more complicated because vertical auto scaling already complicated. There's a lot of concern. So when we talk about the first draft and the second draft, actually the Carol's proposal already is the third draft. Internally, we talk about a lot. And so there's a lot of concern. Currently, I think it is simplify a lot of complexity. So this not overcomplicate again with the pod overhead at this point.
Oh, in terms of scheduler and kubelet admission of the pod, I think it's just going to add another constant to the logic, so it should not really affect unless I miss something.
Yes.
I don't see it really impacting vertical scaling, at least from what I have in the design so far.
Yes.
And so I'm not majorly concerned about it right now.
Mm.
It's a good thing to have to explicitly account the pods. I can really see this coming in play when VM containers like Kata comes into picture.
Yes.
So that was it for me. The only other outstanding item is to see if we can get some additional reviewers to. I'm the owner for this KEP now, and want to see if we can get reviewers. I'm trying to plan out the milestones, what coding milestones I want to have. I'll do that over the next couple of weeks. Once the KEP is merged, I can go to my boss and say, hey, this is kind of in, and we need to push this now. So main thing is to see if we can get another a review and see if there is any see if this converges and it's good enough to merge, drive towards that direction. So David and Derek essentially need to take one pass at it and see, okay, hey, this looks mostly good. Or I know Bobby has already said it's good. So we want you guys from SIG Node to David and Derek to kind of look at it and point out something that might be crazy. I'm hoping that there is nothing like that right now.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, that's all for today, the proposed agenda. I think Patrick, earlier you asked one question, right, related to the CRI group.
Wasn't there a hardware topology note? I think it's on the
I don't
next
think so.
page.
That's next week.
Okay.
Yeah. So Patrick, did you have a question earlier? I remember I saw your message.
Yeah, sorry, a second. Sorry, still getting over a cold. So I saw there was a issue to create a CRI API repo, and I had commented on that, asking some questions about how it relates to CRI tools. But my broader question is, if we need to author changes to the CRI API as we do things like, add Hyper-V support for runtime classes, and implement pod overhead, which is going to need to be reflected in CRI if it's not already there. What is the process, and who are the reviewers for that?
Have you looked at the SIG Node planning, the doc I shared last week? Actually, there's the people driving is the DIMS right now, and the reviewer actually it is the FastCat and Mac Brown, and we still I think this, and of course Yuju, because she is leading of the CI effort, so she definitely will be the one of those reviewer and approver, and not necessarily reviewer but approver at the end.
So I guess getting to the nuts and bolts here, like if we want to change the CRI API, do we still need to open KEPs? Is that the process we're doing, or are we saying that we're going to basically incubate a change to that API and have one KEP to say, here is the new version of the CRI API as a separate ship cycle from Kubernetes?
It will still be in the same cycle as Kubernetes, right? It's a staging repository, so we'll still be making changes to the main Kubernetes repo. So it will just be like sort of vendor out to a different repository so that other repos can just import that repository directly. But all the changes still go through the Kubernetes main repository.
Okay, so the goal is to get that code where it can be vendored in over the course of 15, and then we'll just use the same change control and proposal process that we're using today.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, the process would change.
Yeah. Only for people who want to use in the CRI API to implement CRI compatible.
Yeah, it's the same as Kubernetes API right now. It will just be in the staging repository. So yeah.
Okay. Okay. That clarifies that. And so I'll probably be opening at least one KEP with some changes to that. because specifically on the Windows stuff, there are some things that as I integrate the CRI containerd stuff on there, we want to make sure that we get the right stuff there for Hyper-V, and also making sure that we can disambiguate the OS and the architecture in things like pull and create, sandbox. Because we've got the case now where, we've got Linux nodes that can run both ARM64 and AMD64 code, and we've got, Windows nodes that we're adding support. But I want to make sure that because we're going to use Hyper-V to support running multiple Windows versions side by side on the same node, that's a case where we need to be able to say, when we create a pod, it's going to be this OS version. So, or this, processor architecture. So, okay.
Hey, Patrick, this is Vinay. While you're looking at the CRI, could you also please look at my CAP update, where I saw that there is a need to, in the update container resources, we have the Linux container config. I added a section for Windows container config. Maybe flesh out the details on what that should look like, so that an update would work for Windows as well as Kata Linux, etc.
This is the vertical scaling?
Yes, and the vertical scaling. It was based on your comment, and when I took, I got a chance to run a Windows, manage a Windows node in my cluster, add it, and then try out. I think the outstanding issue, at least the Server 2019 that I used, it doesn't natively support update. Docker update wasn't quite working. So there is a piece on the shim or the CRI portion that needs to be implemented. That's besides that, we need the API change, and I've put that in the API change in our CAP. So please review that, and if you have any ideas on the details of what that should look like, and if what I've said doesn't make sense, I'd like to know about that.
All right, excellent. Yeah. These are the kinds of things I'm looking for. Is I want to make sure that that I'm looking at all the places where things need to change for us to get a really smooth integration with containerd. Because there's a lot of fields that are there on containerd that are not there on the Docker API as related to Windows, and so we need to make sure that those are reflected in CRI. So,
okay.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.
There are any other topic people want to talk about, discuss? Otherwise, I'll call it today.
Oh, thanks for all the help shipping. So.
Wow, someone's laughing.
Hey, Patrick, when you get a chance, it'd be a good idea to get a call going on that subject.
What?
Michael, is that you, Michael?
Yeah.
We cannot hear you. Can you repeat? Sorry.
Yeah. Hold on a second. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Man, you should have heard what I said. It was great stuff. So Patrick, I think we probably need to talk a little bit about that. If what additional changes we need, because there are other patterns we already support, right? Platform selection through manifest indexes, that sort of thing, right? I'm not sure exactly what additional infrastructure you need in CRI over and above just the pattern of selecting the container you want based on a name or a platform that's in a manifest that's already there.
And when you're saying manifest, you're talking about the container manifest, right?
Right. Yeah. So if they had distributed a multi-arc image already, then you shouldn't need to pick anything additional. It should just pick up the right one, right?
Yeah. But like an example case here would be that like right now we've got Windows Server 2019 supported. If somebody takes a dependency on Windows Server, whatever's going to ship, whatever the next version is, they may not be able to build that for the previous version.
I see.
And so the way that we're dealing with that today is we could use, simple, node selectors or taints and tolerations to sort of steer to get onto the right node. But one of the ways that we're solving that problem is we're making it where the newer Windows nodes can be backwards compatible. And so in that case, we need to be able to disambiguate and say, you know, when you do this pull or when you do this run, we want to prefer this specific OS version.
Okay. So that, interesting. So you think that would be a runtime selection option, or is that a, all right, we need a call on it, I guess.
Yeah. So I'll get that written up. I'm going to try to get a summary together, you know, in a doc this week, just so I can sort of circulate that, and then I'll get that turned into a KEP coming up afterwards. And like
and we're not at we're only alpha 2 on CRI, so you may not need a KEP for something like that.
Okay.
We might be able to just handle it with the issues and PRs process, right?
Okay.
Yeah. Because it doesn't sound like a bad, a breaking change.
Okay.
We also just added annotations if you want to look at that as you're going through it. Annotation support.
Okay.
I think we need a doc to discuss this. Just a place where everyone can look at. So yeah, that would be good.
Okay, so I think the DIMS, we are going to send out the cat string. I will poke him, and so then we can carry more discussion there. Okay, that's all for today. So thank you for everyone participating and this one, and talking to you guys next week. Bye.
All right, thanks everyone.